reordering U.S. priorities in Egypt is so important and urgent right now because there's a new authoritarian order in Egypt that is getting more and more entrenched. If we wait 5 months or 6 months, then the possibility of change and playing a constructive role is going to be reduced. But right now, the repression is intensifying against opponents of the coup and the new military order, particularly Islamists, but also a growing number of non-Islamists. So now is the time to try to stop that negative trajectory and say, look, we're not asking you to become a democracy overnight. We have to be realistic too. You can't buy democracy and say, we're going to give you a bunch of money, so get back on track. No, but we can use our leverage to at least get the military to step back from the brink and be somewhat more inclusive, to actually think about how to reintegrate the supporters of the ousted president, Mohamed Morsi, and at least give them a channel to participate in politics. The problem now is that one of the largest organized political force in the country, the Muslim Brotherhood, is being blocked out of politics altogether. That's dangerous because when people don't have legitimate channels to express their grievances, they're more likely to resort to violence. So that's not just an idealism thing of, the value of inclusivity and democracy. It's also a fundamental national security issue for the U.S. This is not good for American security in the medium to longer term. And quite frankly, it's not good now either. I mean, ever since the coup happened in July, the insurgency in Sinai has gathered strength. The Egyptian state has lost some control over towns in Upper Egypt. This is not good for Egyptian stability and, by extension, regional stability. There are other priorities that are taking precedence over what's happening in Egypt. And there was actually a recommendation from the president's national security staff to suspend the bulk of military aid. That recommendation has not been acted upon. Why? Because Syria happened in the interim. And now there's a renewed focus on Iran, and of course there's the Arab-Israeli peace process that Secretary Kerry is heading up. So there are these other sets of priorities that are really consuming the White House and other senior officials. And they're saying to themselves, well, maybe we should do this on Egypt, but then it's going to take away resources from what we're really focusing on. And this brings us to a bigger issue that all of these different conflicts might seem separate in some way, but they are intertwined. One reason we didn't want to suspend aid to Egypt is we needed the Gulf countries on our side when we were considering military strikes on Syria. Did we really want to anger them by suspending aid to Egypt? And that could have caused tension in the relationship and maybe undermined our efforts on Syria and building a real regional and international coalition. So in there, you see a very clear example of how one policy priority takes precedence over another. Both are very important, but in different ways. Obama does not have an Egypt policy. And one reason that we wrote this paper is because we felt it's high time that the U.S. actually rethinks its relationship with Egypt and comes up with an Egypt policy. It doesn't have to be perfect, but at least something that's consistent, and it's not just rhetoric and gestures, but actually a specific set of policies that can advance the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, not just in the short run, but in the long term. And we make a clear distinction between short and long-term interests, because you might say, well, it's good to have the military in power. We can talk to them. They promote our core interests, whether it's the relationship with Israel, supporting us on other regional interests. But I think if you look more medium to longer term, there's a question, again, of how lasting is this kind of so-called stability? And we have to go beyond this kind of ad hoc crisis management approach where we're only looking at the next month or two and say, where is Egypt going to be 3, 4, 10 years from now? And if the answer is not in a good place, then we have to kind of rethink our approach and say, well, what can we do with our levers, our policy levers, our policy tools to try to ground the relationship where we're thinking about where we are down the road? So that's why we also talk about not just negative conditionality where we threaten to withdraw existing aid, but also the promise of additional aid if the Egyptian government actually improves on human rights, on inclusive democracy, on any number of these important indicators. And it's not just the U.S. What the U.S. offers, but also our allies in Europe. There's international financial institutions, the IMF loan. If you put all of this together, you do have a real pot of money that can serve as a positive incentive for the Egyptian military and the military-appointed government.